Hello, and thanks very much, Finn, for inviting me out here. I think the more I've sort of spoken to people here about the specifics of the market community, the more the connections to this tiny little village in Spain have become clear to me. Ostensibly, there isn't a lot in common, but the more you dig down, the clearer it becomes. I suppose, like, to give you a sense of the overview, the story starts really in the late 1970s after the death of Franco, and then proceeds through this intense period of struggle during the 1980s and early 90s, and then indeed on past that, where they've sort of become a beacon of hope in a country that's been beset by just astonishing levels of economic crisis. But we'll get into the detail a bit more later. I'm not going to talk for ages. I'll sort of tell you the basic story, and then maybe we can do some questions and stuff, because I think it's a bit more lively and interesting, and you'll probably have more interesting questions than I would be able to think of anyway. So to conjure the scene a little bit, Marinaleda, as displayed here in this wonderful illustration, which I had absolutely nothing to do with, but it's a tiny little village of 2,500 people, surrounded by just endless miles of olive groves. There are no big cities nearby, really. It's over an hour to Sevilla, or to Malaga, or to Granada, which are the sort of major cities of the south of Spain. But ultimately, it's a sort of isolated island of for many centuries landless labourers. So it's a farming village. These are the neighbouring villages a few miles down the road, are all farming villages of about the same size. And in most of these villages, they're farmers who have never owned land. So they'll be called in for a month or two every year for the harvest and live in abject poverty, really. I was going to say the rest of the time, but all of the time, really, because the meagre earnings from that period would, harvest time would sort of see them through the rest of the year. There aren't really any places in Europe that have quite the level of land inequality that southern Spain do. It's closer to sort of situations in South America, actually, where they call them latifundios, these vast estates that go on for miles and miles and miles, owned by aristocrats. Normally, in Spain, never had land reform like most of Western Europe did. So I'll read a couple of bits here and there, just because it sort of captures some of the atmosphere. Actually, first I should say that this part of Spain is also the place that was historically home to the bandoleros, the bandits, who have become kind of Robin Hood type sort of folk, sort of semi-mythological figures, except they were real. They would rob from the sort of rich people passing through the area, and occasionally give some of that back to the poor, sometimes not. Sort of contentious at this point in history whether you sort of think the bandoleros were a good thing, but either way, there was a sort of outlaw mentality to a lot of these communities. They were presided over by an organisation called the Guardia Civil, mentioned in the Clash song, if that's a useful entry point into Spanish bombs into Spanish history. Basically, an armed police force, a gendarmerie that were serving the interests of power and wealth and landowners, basically, not in any way equitable, really. And then sort of in the 1920s and 30s, ahead of the Civil War, you had a kind of period of intense political ferment as the kind of anarchism took hold in southern Spain, believe it or not. It's generally a sort of fringe ideology that hasn't had a huge impact on the actual kind of outcome of history, certainly in Western Europe, except in southern Spain, where sort of the philosophy of autonomous, self-sustaining villages that were kind of separate from one another but sought control over their own lives really resonated. And so even though a lot of the farmers were illiterate, particularly in the 1920s and 30s, the one guy in a group of friends who could read would sort of read out these anarchist newspapers, and they'd be passed on to sort of the next house, basically. So I'll bring us up to sort of the end of the dictatorship when Franco died in 1975, to give you a sense of just how abject the poverty was at that point in the late 70s, as Spain began its transition to democracy. So here we go. The village was in a truly desperate state by the summer of 1980. In the first 7 months of the year, they had received an equivalent of 200 pesetas per family per day, which is like less than €2 a day. At best, most of the farmers could afford to buy only lentils, rice, onions, and tomatoes from the village shops. Going 2 days without food so that children could eat was common, as was community solidarity. So where families could share their food with one another, they did. One story I'd heard about a group of neighbours clubbing together to buy a gas cylinder for a family of 9 to see them through the cold winter, and it does get bloody cold in the winter, was met with nods of recognition when I repeated this story to other people of the village, the older people. They all remembered stories like this. That was just what you did. Yeah, I'll leave that there for the moment, I think, actually. So you've got a situation of abject poverty. You've got a dictatorship that has finally come to an end, but is on an uneasy path into democracy, and there was a lot of doubt and uncertainty and concern that, you know, another right-wing force, a military junta, something like that, would take over from where Franco had left off. And indeed, there was an attempted military coup in Spain in 1981, when a member of the Guardia Civil, as mentioned before, went into the chamber of the newly established parliament with a gun, and that was quashed, fortunately. In Marinaleda, they were pleased, obviously, that the dictatorship had ended, but they saw it as an opportunity for something better than simply like, well, they basically didn't trust what the new parliamentary democracy was likely to bring them. So they formed, and they also didn't trust the sort of aristocracy of labour, to use a phrase that Finton kept using with me the other day, that was represented in the established party of the centre-left, the PSOE. And so they formed their own political party. They formed a new trade union to represent their interests in a way that they felt they could trust, where they had a direct connection to their representatives. And in 1979, the first free elections in Spain for decades and decades, a young man called Juan Manuel Sánchez Gordillo, who you can't really see, but is there on the book cover and is the basically the protagonist of this whole story, like a kind of messianic figure almost, someone who spoke with incredible fire and passion and fervour. He stood for mayor for the first time, aged only 30 years old. God, that makes me feel old. And won, like, overwhelming majority. And that was kind of the start of his journey to become this, like, figurehead for the left in Spain. He remains, 2017, the mayor of this village. Not quite as young as he used to be, but he has been mayor ever since. And just because people have asked me this in the past, I feel I should clarify. There are free and fair elections in Marinaleda. It may be a unique and strange and unusual place, but they observe Spanish law most of the time. Certainly with, one example is they don't observe the smoking ban in Spain because they've decided that, they want to be able to smoke in the bars. That's never enforced. But the big things, the important things, they observe Spanish law. So they have the same regular free and fair elections as everywhere else in Spain. But this chap, Sánchez Gordillo, kind of models himself on Che Guevara. Tellingly, there are portraits of Che Guevara up in his office. He's won every time by very, very strong majority, and that's basically attributable to the fact that he has worked tirelessly for this community. He has led them on, well, actually we'll get into this now, on what they call la lucha, the struggle, which began after his election in 1979, immediately, basically. So the following year, I guess that's not quite immediately. The following year, 1980, the summer of 1980, they launched a hunger strike against hunger, as they put it. And there were 700 people, including children, took part in this hunger strike. It went on for, I think, 9 or 10 days in the end. They had daily general assemblies during the hunger strike, and indeed prior to calling it in the first place, to determine what their goals were, how they would, making sure that people were cared for who were becoming hypoglycemic or in one case fell into a coma and stuff, trying to look out for their health, but also to determine the sort of, how this hunger strike was going. So it's 1980, obviously there's no internet, and there was no TV coverage of tiny little villages in remote rural areas, but they launched it basically with a very keen eye on the media, as it was constituted in Madrid, the capital, but also in the regional capital in Seville. And this chap, Sanchez Gordillo, the mayor, has always had a very strong eye for how to use what the anarchists call propaganda of the deed to get maximum attention for the village and the citizens there. So a thing that I've observed, I've never actually got him to confirm this to me as his strategy, but I'm pretty sure this must be the case. They often do these big actions in August, which seems like it might be slightly dead time. It's the middle of the summer, you're not going to get as much attention, but it's actually the fact that the major politicians are all on holiday, sunning themselves on a yacht somewhere in the Caribbean or what have you, and that the fact that there isn't so much news coming from the central government in Madrid, that means that there's sort of a bit of a gap there that can be taken advantage of by a very spectacular action, such as a hunger strike, as it was in 1980. So in this first hunger strike, they had quite specific demands. They were starting relatively small, and they wanted it's quite nuanced, but like a community subsistence pay that had been cut in previous years to be increased because of the levels of hunger I was describing before, of people going 2 days without food to feed their kids and so on. They built this up over the coming years, with a series of, and I'll just summarize here because there's a whole chapter or so on it. They did roadblocks, they did a light strike where they turned all the lights out every night. They marched on the regional capital, Seville, which is a 21-hour walk away. There were more hunger strikes in 1982, 83, 84. They occupied a nearby reservoir to demand the irrigation of the land around them to make it more fertile and productive. They blocked airports, or rather occupied airports. They blocked train routes. And each time it was calculated, the thoughts of the media were very uppermost in their mind, because actually people who may well have been sympathetic living in the big cities had absolutely no idea how they were living in the same country. They were genuinely shocked and astonished. And indeed, that first hunger strike even pulled in TV news crews and print journalists from the UK, from Germany, from France, and was a genuine public embarrassment to the Spanish government at the time. Hence they got their little mini victory, and that process kept repeating itself. The really big one, the really decisive protest during this period of struggle was in 1985, also in August, when they had identified a piece of farmland that was, how far is it, 10 miles away from the village, that was being used to plant wheat and sunflowers. And the significant thing about that is that it's very low intensity. It requires 3 or 4 caretakers to drive around and keep an eye on it, but it doesn't really generate employment. And that's ultimately what they wanted. Their answer to land inequality was, we want land. We want land to farm for ourselves. We're not interested in profiteering and making ourselves millionaires. We want enough land to grow enough food to feed ourselves, to end this centuries-old kind of poverty that had affected people in that part of the world. And so they marched the 10 miles to this one bit of farmland they'd identified, belonged to someone called the Duke of Infantado. He owned 17,000 hectares of land, was fabulously wealthy, as all of the aristocrats who owned sort of most of the farmland in southern Spain were. And they were demanding 1,200 hectares out of that 17,000 hectares to become their own farm that they would run and manage and farm collectively. They didn't get it in 1985. I mean, that was a big ask, I suppose, but they went relentlessly there. They went there every day. The Guardia Civil would evict them at sort of 6 p.m. at the end of the day. They would march all the way back to the village again. They'd get up the next morning and they'd go back again. The Guardia Civil would do things like they cut down the trees to make sure that, or they cut the branches off the trees so that there was no shade in this bit of farmland, which in the 45-degree heat of the Andalusian summer is a hardship. I don't think I could even stay conscious in that heat, but they kept on protesting throughout that August. And their goal was always, and Sanchez Gordillo was very clear about this in his numerous interviews with the newspapers, that their aim was to create jobs, not profit, to put the people of Marinaleda in employment. And if we fast forward to 1991, with the Seville Expo, the World Expo was coming to Seville, like a big, carnival type fair thing with the whole of the world's media and loads of tourists coming to Seville. The people of Marinaleda saw an opportunity for an acceleration and to finally, seal the deal, as it were. And so they started blocking like trains and airports even more in Seville, until eventually the regional government in Seville saw that we're about 6 months out until the world, the whole world arrives in Seville, and these people have been a relentless nuisance. They've been causing us trouble for over a decade now, and they basically held up their hands and went, you know what, have the land. And so they got in touch with the Duke of Infantado, this fabulously wealthy duke, who I'm quite sure would not have cared either way what happened to that land, except on a matter of principle. He felt it was his and it belonged to his family. But the regional government paid off the duke for that land and gave it as a gift, ostensibly, to the people of Marinaleda, at which point, that's sort of the end point of their story, in the sense that they got what they wanted, and they were able to then begin slowly cultivating it into the kind of to the kind of use that they felt was appropriate, which was basically to generate as much work as possible. So instead of growing wheat and sunflowers, they grew pimento peppers and green beans and artichokes. And the reason for that is that this actually requires quite a lot of work. It requires labour. It's quite technical. You can't just have like a one harvesting machine do it with a sort of caretaker watching over. And so they then to create this workers' cooperative. The rules that maintain until this day is that if you want work, it is available to you. You're put into a particular group of workers, and I've had this bizarre experience the first time I visited. You can just be sitting there at about 6 or 7 in the evening, maybe having an evening coffee or a beer, and a car drives around the village with a loudspeaker. Someone with a loudspeaker kind of standing out, leaning out the window and going, "There is work tomorrow for Group B. Please present yourself at 6 a.m. in the car park," and you'll sort of hear it. It's sort of it feels a bit like being lost in a maze and sort of hearing your mate shouting, "I'm over here," because it goes in and out all of the houses of this town. I think there are other ways that the people would find out. It's not like if you miss that, then you miss your day's work, but it's really operates as a reminder more than anything. In fact, someone told me that in the 80s they couldn't afford a car, so someone went round on a bike with the loudspeaker shouting. But yeah, everyone is paid, 47 euros a day for their labour on the farm, which is astonishingly more than twice the Spanish minimum wage. The cost of living is very low. It's probably about it's €1 for a glass of wine. It's €1 for a beer. If you order a little tapas from one of the cafes, it's €1 as well. It's not an expensive place to live, but yeah, 47 euros a day represents a massive sort of enough to sort of feel some degree of financial security, which is in stark contrast with the surrounding villages. And that's actually one of the key things about Marinaleda in the period of economic crisis since the global financial crash is you have unemployment levels in Marinaleda are like 3 or 4%, and that mostly accounts for people who've newly arrived in the village and haven't really settled into it. Neighbouring villages, it can be up to 60 or 70% unemployment. Andalusia, I did just check this because I read this book in 2013 and I know there's been a slight economic recovery, green shoots and all that. It was 36%. Yeah, unemployment in Andalusia is now 32%. Youth unemployment was 55% in Andalusia when I wrote this book, and it's now come down as far as 46%, although apparently that's largely because young people in Andalusia, in the south of Spain, feel like, well, there's no work here, and they've been emigrating en masse. So most of major cities in Northern Europe are now full of Spanish-speaking young people, which is that may be fun and exciting for them on one level, but it's also something that's not really a matter of choice. It can be obviously a wrench for families. It can it also has like economic implications for the future of Spain as well. If you have this brain drain of a lot of these people who have done university degrees but can't find work in a bar in southern Spain at the moment. And part of the reason for that is that a lot of them would have left school at 15 or 16 to go and work on construction sites during the 2000s. So I guess that doesn't apply to the graduates, but there was a real, with the Spain's economic miracle in the first decade of this century, meant that there were just cranes and like hotels and blocks of flats going up across, particularly the south of Spain. Just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of new buildings were built with really dodgy financing. The work was incredibly well paid on these construction sites. They just needed as many people as they could to come and lend their hands to it. And then so many of these projects went bankrupt, and you had a lot of lads and lasses as well who had got a mortgage on a place, maybe started a family, had no formal education, and there was suddenly, you're left with like the carcass of half of a block of flats and a mortgage you can't pay, which led to 400,000 evictions in Spain after 2008. There are also 3.4 million empty homes in Spain, incredibly, because a lot of them were finished and no one can afford to buy them, basically. And a lot of people have moved back in with their parents and don't really see any prospect of leaving. Which actually brings me to housing in the village. It's one of the achievements they really started working on after they won this farmland in 1991, was to create a situation where people could build homes that were not a commodity, that were not something to be speculated on and made profit from, but actually just family homes. And they managed to, again through protest, negotiate an arrangement with the regional government where they would get bricks and mortar and the help of an architect to design the home, and then they build it themselves with the help of friends and neighbours. Then after that, you pay a mortgage of 15 euros a month. It's really a nominal admin fee, really, to live in this house. The key thing is, though, it's yours for as long as you want it. If you suddenly decided you don't want to live in Marinaleda anymore, you want to move to the big city, you can't then sell it on for profit. The house reverts to the ownership of the village and it's passed to the next family on the waiting list. But they essentially subverted the housing crisis as it exists in a lot of parts of the world, but in Spain, but across Western Europe, by creating a situation where shelter is seen as a right and not something that can be speculated on and made profit from. And I suppose another thing I want to say is that that collective spirit that comes through in the period of protest in the 1980s, that led to them building houses together for each other. It also exists in the cultural life of the town. They have an absolutely just vibrant cultural life of kind of sporting events. There's a sports stadium which has a massive mural of Che Guevara on the side, actually, which is depicted on the cover of the book there. They've got a swimming pool which costs €3 a year for membership of, which again, just a nominal fee, really. There's a creche, which is something like 10-12 euros a month, I think, to have your kids looked after. They have developed their own media, their own TV station, their own radio station, and in fact, Sanchez Gordillo, I think, became slightly more like some of his heroes, like Chavez and so on, when he had this TV program for a long time where he would just talk about the politics of the day. It was a phone-in, actually, but it was directly inspired by Chavez, because I think he did a similar thing. You'd phone in and ask a question, and then he would just talk, but there was not really a time limit on it, because they didn't really have a schedule, so he would just talk for about 3 hours, basically. I'm not sure how many people actually tuned into that, like the viewing figures weren't available, but I think he liked the sound of his own voice, or continues to do so. But yeah, it was, it's also part of their sort of sense that the media were never going to give them a fair crack of the whip, and that they had to start making their own media, which is not an uncommon kind of decision. It's an interesting duality there, because they did also use the Spanish media and indeed the international media to embarrass sort of national politicians and make, just really highlight highlight their hypocrisy and how detached they were from the realities of life in really poor villages in the south of Spain. There's one other thing that really kind of exemplifies the spirit, community spirit in this village. Here we go. I'm just going to read from it because it's easier. One of the most... Is this the bit I want to read? Yes. One of the most well-known symbolic and practical activities in Marinaleda is the ritual of Domingos Rojos, Red Sundays. Once a month, so the theory goes, the people of the village gather on a Sunday morning outside the sindicato, which is like the trade union building, usually as early as 8 a.m, and depending on individual capabilities and a popular vote on what needs doing most urgently, the participants proceed to spend the day working voluntarily to improve the village. This could mean gardening in the public park, painting murals, sweeping the streets, or helping bring in the harvest in El Humoso, which is the name of the collective farm. Red Sundays were born out of an argument between the village and the Prime Minister at the time, Felipe González. This is in the 80s. In a 1983 speech, González, who was also an Andalusian, dusted off the old canard that Andalusian farm labourers were lazy and accused them of spending their community employment pay, like welfare payment, on luxuries like cars. Marinaleda held a Saturday night assembly and decided to devote the next day to improving the village. Sanchez Gordillo called up the press and informed them as follows, quote, "We want to demonstrate that in order to find laziness and corruption, the Prime Minister should look not at the Andalusian peasants, but somewhere closer to home. We want to show him that when the government rests, the peasants are working." And so the next day they set about several hours of street repair, painting and landscaping the public squares. It was a defiant performance to the outside world and a humiliation for the Prime Minister. They don't do those so often anymore, but then I probably won't have time to account for this now. The last few years have seen Sanchez Gordillo affected by depression, which has meant that he hasn't been as involved in public life as he used to be, and actually a lot of the stuff that I've written about, well, it is accounted for in the last chapter because it was just starting to happen in 2012. A lot of the activity of the village, so like the regular general assemblies to debate the future of the town, which often involved a lot of disagreement, because obviously you're going to have people who do not believe in the same, process or goals for a community. But they were always fleshed out there, with honesty and candour. They're not happening as much as they used to apparently, and nor are the Domingo Rojos, which is a real shame. But it's got to the stage where he really ought to probably stand down and let someone else take over, but nobody else wants to. So it's not like a dictatorial grip on power so much as, because the last election was 2 years ago, and I was out there just to sort of catch up with people, and everyone was sort of saying, yeah, he'll probably stand down, but we don't really know, nobody wants to take the place of this messianic, this figure that looms so large over the village. And in the end, no one would. So he stood again and won again, but he's not as sort of fully involved as he used to be. Is there anything else I really have to say? Probably not really. I think we should probably throw it open to questions. But yeah, that's the sort of basic story of the village and how it's become this beacon, essentially, in an area of poverty, of unemployment and idleness. And ultimately, I think the goal was always for them to take control over their own lives, and they've achieved that. The Marinaleda is very famous in Spain now, particularly during the crisis, the economic crisis, and with some of you may know of the Indignados movement of 2011. Where hundreds of thousands of people occupied squares in Seville, in Madrid, in Barcelona. At that point, that's actually when I was writing my book, Sanchez Gordillo and Marinaleda really came to prominence again, in fact, probably for a new generation of activists and people who wanted to see Spain sort of transform, because they were able to point at this village and say, well, if they've got almost full employment and good resources, leisure resources, sporting, they've got 2 football teams that actually do really well for a village of 2,500 people. If they've managed to do that, then why is there such abject unemployment and wastage sort of in so many other villages, but also in the big towns? So Sanchez Gordillo would travel around kind of doing national media on a really regular basis. He also, this is one more thing that's worth mentioning, in 2012, a stunt to end all stunts, and it was an absolute genius bit of propaganda of the deed. Sanchez Gordillo and other like 100 other people from the village went into a supermarket in the absolute like pits of the economic crisis. They went into a supermarket, filled up the trolleys not with luxury items but with chickpeas, rice, olive oil, which is not really a luxury in Spain. It's, you know, it's just something you need for all the food you're making, and it's actually quite cheap as well. So they filled it up with very basic necessities. It's like 4 or 5 trolleys, and wheeled them out of the store. And there was a bit of a scuffle, and the staff there were like, what the hell do you think you're doing? But they successfully got the food out, and then, in a obviously very symbolic display, donated it to a food bank in the nearby city for people who were struggling to feed their families. This was also in the beginning of August. All the politicians were on holiday, you know, again, on a yacht in the Caribbean, while their citizens are suffering. And as a like spectacular headline-grabbing thing, it really worked. It led the entire Spanish media basically to go and decamp to Marinaleda and to other poor villages and to ask questions about why are people hungry, what's going on. And again, just an incredibly effective political stunt. They knew it was a stunt. They knew they weren't going to actually successfully feed more than a few families doing this, but they also, it was, you know, a very astute reading of the political situation and the detachment of the media and the political class in Madrid from the realities of people's ordinary lives. So yeah, that's probably a good place to stop. Ask some questions though, please. Do you have a question, Vince? No. Okay.
Just make yourself small. So I just want to get started with the idea that a lot of the actions since this started seem to involve beyond just shame or embarrass the government or the people with power. So this is a sort of non-violent protest where you can make your point by basically pointing out hypocrisy. And like you say, some of these are stunts, but it requires that the people in charge or the people with power are embarrassable.
Yeah.
When they care about me.
Yeah.
The pointing out the hypocrisy is bad for them.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of feels that something has changed in the last couple of years, I can't quite put my finger on it, where people seem unembarrassable now. They're shamefacedly lying.
Yeah, how does that tactic work in the age of Trump and Farage?
It sounds like they have other things that they're still doing, which is consciousness raising, that they're the indignados are being able to say to people, you are being left out, you should be angry. So spreading a flame to other people. But actually, the job of embarrassing the people with power, maybe, is that hard?
It does. I mean, the Spanish political establishment specifically is one that has just made corruption a way of life for a really long time, and that's not just sort of me saying that in a sort of, screw you politicians. It just, you know, there are court cases, a lot of court cases going on. And it's brought in the royal family, like the heads of most of the banks there that were kind of complicit in the financial crisis as well. The entire political and economic establishment of Spain, pretty much, is not all of it, but like, you know, it really runs like through a stick of rock or something, like through the Spanish establishment. That's what's led to Podemos, this new party, being able to say, to come from nowhere to be like briefly the second biggest party, now just about the third biggest party, by saying, you know, we need a completely new politics. So yeah, certainly at that point, they were embarrassable, and that corruption, it was assumed to be going on by ordinary citizens, definitely, like, you know, I would just assume that, but that didn't stop the revealing of it being something that was quite dramatic and changed sort of the attitude to the political class there. The thing of unembarrassable politicians, that's a really new development, I think, isn't it? You know, what 5-10 years ago we might have assumed, like, oh, well, you know, so and so has been caught saying this thing or lying flagrantly in a political speech. Well, they're not done for, right? That doesn't seem to be a problem. So how does that develop? I don't have an answer to that. I'm just waffling to avoid answering a question, basically. But it's a question we should all be asking ourselves. Yeah, is that kind of tactic still one that would work? I mean, I would like to think that that Trump and maybe Farage are like outliers, but then they're also quite powerful. So I would hope it would still work for the majority of politicians, of whichever political stripe, who would like to believe that they were speaking the truth, even if they differ on particular issues. I would hope that would still work, because it is what's worked for Marinaleda over the years, and you can see why, really.
Are you aware of like similar initiatives, or if there has been an attempt to explore Marinaleda to other towns in Seville or in Andalusia, and has been
So it's a really good question. Like, in the early days, there were a lot of the surrounding villages that were experiencing that same level of poverty, but did not have a Sanchez Gordillo figure to sort of leading them, had expressed a lot of solidarity. So when the first hunger strike happened in 1980, there were strikes in nearby villages by way of sort of show of solidarity with them. And I suppose in an attempt to kind of support that argument of, like, at that time it was, we need a greater community employment payment, to sustain us until the next harvest, because people are starving. And that community, that when they won in 1980, that was given to all of Andalusia. So that was not a village specific thing. It was led by Marinaleda, but it helped everybody. In terms of actually exporting this model, the short answer is it hasn't happened. Like, there are the nearby village, the attitude to Marinaleda in the nearest village, which is called El Rubio, is one of skepticism mostly. And the way that they vote is generally slightly more to the right. And I think some in-depth ethnographic research into why this is would be really interesting, because I don't honestly know, but a lot of these villages have a really distinct identity. So Marinaleda is like the red village, it's really communist. And then there's a village a few miles over which is like the party village, and their carnival is known as the best in the whole area, and that's the one you should go to. And how those identities develop, I have no idea. It's really interesting, but it's not something I can really explain. So no, Marinaleda has been like a source of inspiration for a lot of activists around, and the trade union that was created there is one that definitely has footholds in other villages, but nowhere else has managed to replicate this, which is, would be intriguing to see if that was possible. Then you would suddenly have this idea of this network of self-sustaining villages across the south would be incredible. But no one has successfully copied or even really tried to copy the model. They may have taken some direct inspiration from it, but that's it really.
To what extent are the people empowered through things like workers' councils and trade unions? And perhaps does that explain why they don't want to send someone up again for mayor? Is the mayor simply a figurehead, whereas the real power is kept in councils of the people?
So there are, on this, it's a good question. The village council has 11 councillors on it, and the political party that the mayor, Sanchez Gordillo, is from, normally has 9 out of the 11. They had 9 out of the 11 at the beginning in the first election in 1979, and that's remained fairly constant. I think there was a bit of a drift back in the early 2000s, and they had 7 compared to 4. But I'm pretty sure the latest thing is the latest election, had that same balance of 9 to 2. Just to give you a sense of how the voting breaks down. Sanchez Gordillo is not just a figurehead, certainly. He wields a lot of influence. There was a Spanish academic who studied the village and wrote an academic book about it a few years before I went out there. That is a really quite strong critique of what he calls messianic leadership. So this academic kind of had this feeling that through quite subtle means, Sanchez Gordillo was influencing the villagers, that there wasn't necessarily direct bullying going on, you have to vote with the mayor, but that it was that he had a certain type of stranglehold over it. That's a really delicate thing that's hard to prove either way. His critics say he's it's anti-democratic, and I'm not sure there's that much evidence of that. but the councillors certainly have a lot of power as well. Like so decision making is made at that's all by way of explaining that like they do have regular general assemblies where these things are debated as a village. Not everyone goes to them, but often several hundred people will go to the village general assembly. And if Sanchez Gordillo is ill, as he has been a lot recently, it will be one of the councillors will stand in. And those are people with, some of them are like early to mid-20s and have just signed up to do this for the first time, having been inspired by the stories told to them by their parents. Some of them are sort of middle-aged and have been doing it for as long as Sanchez Gordillo, basically. And so they're really experienced. They're less complicated figures than Sanchez Gordillo. There are a couple of women particularly who are sort of, I think, in their late 40s, 50s now, who are really trusted and liked by everyone, who do a lot of the work that when Sanchez Gordillo has been ill, that he's not able to. So it's not simply a like one man and then like the rabble sort of thing. Like there are levels of interaction there, and the councillors do take on quite a lot of responsibility. But the ideal for the village is always that they take these decisions collectively at an assembly, and they'll have a vote. If it's something that needs a vote, it will come down to a vote and a show of hands. And if it's a tight vote, then they'll really make sure they count every single one. It's complicated, but yes, there's a little bit of everything there. Like I think. Anyone else?
Just comparison, that small village.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any about the communist part of it?
Mm-hmm.
Although the mayor, I didn't read the whole book now, but I could read the whole book yet. The mayor's quote was Che Guevara, who's anti-communist.
Yeah, interesting. So sorry.
But another part of the question is, does that small community, although under Franco, probably wouldn't be allowed to read that famous book,
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so there was a lot of censorship under Franco, that's very true. And political activity in villages like this under Franco was incredibly limited. I didn't actually mention all of the things like torture and arrest, and I mean Sanchez Gordillo himself, even since democracy arrived, has been imprisoned sort of 7 or 8 times. There were a couple of assassination attempts by right-wing figures. They never really got close, but and this was back in the 80s actually. But yeah, the political consciousness during the Franco period was incredibly hard to sustain, and people were just struggling to get by mostly. And it's the sense I get from speaking to older members of the village. And the Communist Party were in exile at that time in France, I think. As to the communism of the village, Sanchez Gordillo is not an ideological Puritan in that he sort of seems to take a lot of things from different areas. In fact, he literally said that to me. He was like, I'm not a big C communist. I believe in, I think Lenin had some good ideas. I think Gandhi had some good ideas. I haven't spoken to him at length about his feelings on Che Guevara, but he definitely does have his picture on the wall, and indeed on the wall of the the football stadium as well. But his sort of reading of political philosophy is to take influences from various different places and use that. And he's fond of quoting people, so he'll quote he quoted Gandhi to me, peace is not just the absence of violence, but the practice of justice. I don't think he ever quoted Lenin to me, but he was fairly widely read in terms of the different political influences, but ultimately kind of used it to forge his own philosophy. And he wrote a book in 1980 which outlines his philosophy, which, if I'm going to try and boil it down to one idea, it's that land, and it's very specific to the peasant experience, the farming experience in southern Spain, is that the land belongs to the people that work it. So the people that work on the land have the right to that land. Some, duchess or duke who owns vast amounts and is fabulously wealthy. In fact, one of the local duchesses has the most titles of any woman in the world, apparently. Ultimately their political philosophy is that stuff should be as much as possible owned in common, and it's quite a practical philosophy. Basically, it's based around the fact that he wanted the villagers to do things together. He sort of said, you know, we do everything. We try and do everything together. We plant trees together. You know, we work together. We celebrate together. I don't think I mentioned their fiestas. They're like annual fiestas are huge affairs in which everyone volunteers and takes part, from 7 years old to 70 plus. So yeah, that answers your question in a roundabout sort of way. I don't know specifically what he thinks about Che Guevara, but that's a good point. But he's not. I think it's that while he's widely read, he would say bits of this are good, bits of this are good, bits of this are good. Here's my philosophy.
How much of those ideas fed through to the mentality that people bring through the village? I mean, he's very strong on his views, but would you find people that are more critical of their society, to be more aware of what influences their lives and how their lives controlled by different things? And we walk through Belfast and spoke to people, we walk in London and spoke to people, would people be more clued in? What governs their lives and more active?
I think, yeah. I mean, I think there is there's a greater level of political awareness and participation than I've seen in anywhere else I've lived or visited. Really, that doesn't mean that there aren't large numbers of people for whom their attitude to the history of the village, particularly younger people, actually, their attitude to the history of the village and the history of the struggle is essentially I'm really particularly, so the younger people, a lot of them would actually say, I'm really proud of what my parents achieved, my parents' generation achieved here. I don't really want to work on a farm, and this is wonderful what they've created, but I want something different from my life. And that will be the medium to long-term threat to the sustainability of this project. I mean, the other big question is what happens when Sanchez Gordillo finally steps down or dies. But actually, they've got TV and the internet, and they've seen that there's a more exciting life available. Transport is easier than it was 150 years ago. They could go and move to Seville, move to Madrid, move to Malaga, or indeed anywhere beyond that. And those two thoughts they can hold in their head at the same time, which is this is not a world that I actually can hold me, and they want to spread their wings somewhat. Some of them were experiencing a really direct tension there of their again, pride in what their parents had achieved, but also this isn't for me, because the financial crisis had meant so you leave Marinaleda and you go to the city for what? There's no work there. There's no work there. I can get a house more easily here than I would be able to anywhere else. In terms of criticism of the project and from within the village, there's a whole chapter in the book about the opposition in the village, which I didn't really touch on when I was doing my sort of rundown there. I mentioned that there's 9 out of the 11 councillors are sort of supportive of the project and quite gung-ho about it. The other 2, at any one time, tend to be from the sort of main right-wing party, the Partido Popular, who are in government at the moment. And though that represents, I suppose, the constituency of people in the village for whom, this is their village, they've always lived there, their family have always lived there, but this communist nonsense that, the Sanchez Gordillo, the mayor, and his supporters go on about is exactly that, a nuisance, and that they think it's corrupt, which, again, not really evidence of that. But there were examples in the 80s of people who supported Sanchez Gordillo, spraying, keying the car of the opposition candidate and stuff. That's the most concrete thing I can think of that was recorded by someone as happening. But it's sort of the tensions in the village between sort of people with different political beliefs are mostly expressed through kind of sullen, kind of, people making sort of eyes at each other and not talking to each other and gossiping. Gossip is a huge thing, as it is in any community, right? but particularly in a village where you don't, like, once you leave the village, there are fields. Like, there's not really anywhere else to go. I grew up in South London, like in a city of how many, 7 million people. So I found it quite suffocating living there. And I mean, I was an outsider, like, you know, but that's just about the difference between city life and village life, I suppose. Like, but yeah, gossip is actually, I think, a really major force in how the dynamics of like, of the politics of the town function. I hope that's sort of answered your question, roundabout sort of way.
You answered a wee bit of what I was going to ask. Is it all agricultural work then? So is everybody working in agricultural? And if so, then if they're selling their produce, which I know is quite cheap in Andalusia, how do they make enough money to pay? So what way is that actually?
Yeah, I need to explain that. That's a good question. Like, so they most of the produce is not sold in the village. That's the key thing. Like, they there's actually a website where you can, if you want to order some peppers, I think you may have to order them in bulk. And I'm not sure they get that many international orders, but they do get a few. I would have brought some with me, but I thought I wouldn't be able to get it in the don't have hold baggage. But I have at home some like Marinaleda peppers and stuff. They built a factory. I didn't mention that either. After they'd got the farm and established that, which obviously is not an overnight thing. During the 90s, they then built a factory for jarring and canning a lot of the produce for sale. As to the specific economics of how much that's sold for, I mean, they're sold mostly to supermarkets in the region. I think they do get some orders from France as well.
Is it organic?
Sorry?
Do they grow organic? Or?
No, they don't. They do. In terms of like ethical capitalism or whatever, they do have on the cans and the jars, like they make a big thing, as you would expect them to really, to make a big thing of like you're buying peppers that have been produced by a cooperative farm that is sustaining employment for a whole community. Like, you know, why wouldn't you mention that really? But no, they don't. It's not organic. So yeah, is that to answer your question? No, there was another part of your question. What else did you want to know?
So they sell that, and then out of that, the wages are split equally?
Yeah, so and I guess that's the key point. The wages are the same. There'll be 47 euros per day for everybody. You won't be guaranteed like full-time work, but you'll be given as much work as there is. It's divided equally. The amount of days work there is, and obviously that will slightly change depending on the season and what's being harvested, will be distributed equally among the people in the volunteer workers. And then you asked about people doing other types of work. That was the other thing. There are cafes, bars. There's not loads of other employment in the village, basically, which is why a lot of people leave. But there's a primary school and a secondary school, so there are some teachers that live there. There is several bars and cafes, like far more actually than you'd get in a village of equivalent size elsewhere. There's one particular spot called Palo Palo, which is like a music venue as well as a bar, that when I met people in Seville and first started hearing about this village, like way over a decade ago, some of them would be like, oh yeah, the communist village, yeah, I guess I have heard of that. I actually went once, but just for a rock concert, so they have, like, they actually get some tourism from outside, because people, like particularly young people, will go and see the rock bands there. They love ska, unfathomable to me, but they love ska, punk and stuff. So yeah, like local bands from around the south will kind of travel there. So that generates income for the village. One suggestion that some of the British, there's like a bunch of British retirees who live out there actually as well, who have mostly no interest in the politics of the village and have just ended up there by chance, which again I find really weird. They're like, yeah, it's a strange old village. Anyway, you know, we're going off to the pool. But they had suggested to me actually in conversation, like, I don't know why the locals don't like make more of a big deal of marketing Marinaleda, because you get visitors, not just me. Like I met so many like a French photographer and a film crew from Russia and like a American student who's travelled there to like because he wants to see a communist utopia in action. You get a lot of people coming into town, and the theory that one of the British pensioners mentioned to me was like, well, you know, they should be selling T-shirts, they should be selling like your book, they should be selling like DVDs, you know, mouse mats, whatever. Like, And I'm not sure, they generally, I mean, they haven't done that, and I don't think that's particularly because of a political objection. When I've mentioned it to locals, they've gone, I suppose so, but they kind of, they do mostly like the attention of having people coming, like dropping in a way that you know, they wouldn't in any neighbouring village, because it's just a small rural community. They do generally like the attention. They are, and actually they're currently building a hostel, but that's been going on for about 5 years now, and they're sort of half finished. That is partly because of like funding shortfalls, because they have been hit by the economic crisis as well. But yeah, developing other revenue streams for the village, it does happen, but it's not. It's still a minor part, basically.
Helen?
So I was wondering about the gender dynamics of the
Uh-huh.
village. So, you
Yes.
know, is it quite gender stereotyped, or in this socialist utopia?
It's a good question. It's certainly like among older members of the community, like there's fairly traditional gender roles that are observed. As you kind of move down the age brackets, like the people who are doing the work in the fields tend to be fairly evenly split in terms of gender, actually. And it does tend to be younger people doing it because it is back-breaking work. Like it's, you know, and I mean, even when it's not 40-degree heat or whatever in the summer, like it's really, really uncomfortably hot, even in the autumn and the spring, really. And it's hard work, which is part of the reason I think a lot of the young people growing up there are like, I don't want to do this for my whole life. Like, but no, I mean, a lot of like women of the house will be homemakers, I suppose. But saying that, like I think the one really obviously positive thing about the sort of gender dynamics of their politics is that the council is more like there's more female councillors than there are male councillors, and I'm sure there have been specific examples of like gender education days that they've done and stuff as part of like the kind of community activities and stuff. And they've also done marches against domestic violence and stuff, which have involved other like parts of the trade union and villages as well, but was led very much by Marinaleda. So on the whole, positive, I would say.
Anyone else?
So you see across sort of as a kind of republicanism spread across France in the revolution, and there was a kind of big backlash against the royal clerics and kind of the role that the church had kind of brought up. Ownership of land and other notions of vested interest and power. Is there a church in this village?
There's two.
And would you say that this movement that's been around since the 1790s is driven by a sort of secularist value as well as?
It is, yeah. There's a real tension there actually over religion. A lot of the villages, particularly the older ones, are reasonably observant. Although, if you were to look at a graph of like observant church-going Christians in Spain over the last 50 years, it kind of falls off a cliff. Like it declined rapidly after the death of Franco. The church still has a lot of power in Spain generally. In fact, I'm sure there's some tax that until very recently had to be paid, like on obligation by everyone, which basically funded the church specifically. There are two churches in Marinaleda, like a lot of villages is there a map? I think there is, though you won't be able to see it, but there's a map on the inside of the cover of the village. A lot of these villages evolve with like two ends of the town, and they are often slightly distinctive communities with like it's weirdly like split in two, but like not on any particular class grounds that I can see, or any other particular grounds, but like they sort of have their own little hub either in the village. So both of those have a church. They're both used, not a lot. And they don't currently have a priest, basically. So a priest will come and visit from another village nearby. But for Sanchez Gordillo and his most staunch supporters, they're not anti-religion, but they feel like their politics is not informed by religion particularly. Though I think Sanchez Gordillo did say, you know, Jesus Christ was a good socialist to me, which is fairly uncontroversial point, but like, yeah, so it's part, you know, but I think he views kind of the Gospels as just another thing like the writings of Lenin, from which you can take some things that you find inspiring. But it's ultimately a secular movement, yeah. But the people still go to church when the priest comes basically, and visits.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you so much.